Well, thank you for all for coming, and thank you, Dieter and Christine. I appreciate the generosity of your introduction. And we begin. This is like an old-fashioned thing called a lecture. As you know, I'm not going to be hitting any buttons for you. Law legitimates power. Constitutionalism is part of this larger project. But how do constitutions gain this claim to authority? I will be exploring this question in the spirit of Max Weber, who famously distinguished three ways in which power seeks to legitimate authority: by appealing to charisma, or tradition, or bureaucratic rationality. But when we look around the world, we see that there's something called constitutionalism, which is none of these. So if what we actually want to understand in the 21st century is how power really tries to legitimate itself, we also have to understand constitutionalism. And in the spirit of Max Weber, I'm developing three ideal types. Three paths, if you like, to constitutionalism. Under the first path, a movement of revolutionary outsiders mobilizes against the existing government at time one. Many would-be revolutionaries are crushed at this point. But many other movements have triumphed over the status quo. This sets the stage for the founding of the new regime at time two. During this period, the revolutionary movement culminates its triumph by elaborating a constitution that codifies the fundamental principles of the new regime. Since the revolutionaries challenged the status quo, they often gained ascendancy only after military struggle. For example, Nelson Mandela's African National Congress would never have gained power without a decade of or more of guerrilla warfare by the spear of the nation with which it was associated. Similarly, the political leaders who constructed the constitutions of Italy and the French and Fourth and Fifth Republics came out of the wartime resistance. It was by virtue of this militarized struggle in the name of the people of France and Italy that the movement parties of the resistance, of which there were three, communists, socialists, and Christian Democrats, or popular Republicans in the French case, same thing, won the authority to establish post-war constitutions and to proclaim a revolutionary break with the fascist regimes of Pétain and Mussolini. But revolutionary movements may also rely much more heavily on more peaceful forms of civil disobedience, as in the case of Nehru and the Congress Party in India, or Valenza and Solidarity in Poland. The key point is that the revolutionary movement sustained self-sacrifice during time one, gains broad public recognition of its legitimate authority to establish a new constitution in the name of the people at time two. But constitutions also emerge from a second and very different ideal type. In this second pathway, the political order is constructed by pragmatic insiders, not revolutionary outsiders. When confronting mobilized movements for fundamental change, the insider establishment responds with strategic concessions that split the outsiders into moderate and radical wings. When this strategy works, the insiders reinvigorate their authority by enacting landmark reform legislation which invites sensible, quote-unquote, outsider groups to desert their more radical colleagues and join in the governing establishment. Great Britain provides a paradigmatic example. During the Napoleonic Wars, its governing elite repudiated revolution as a model for legitimate change, very self-consciously. Think Edmund Burke, but many others. But over the next generation, it also rejected the Duke of Wellington's hardline efforts at suppression of outsiders. And enacted, for example, the Reform Act of 1832, which invited sensible outsiders into the system. This set the stage for further acts of strategic concession at later moments of confrontation. For example, the Parliament Act of 1911, which sets the foundation for the modern welfare state in England. Such landmarks represent fundamental elements of the British Constitution, but they lack the ringing statements of principle comparable to revolutionary texts presented, for example, in the South African Bill of Rights. And they are not adopted in the name of a mobilized movement for revolutionary redefinition of a national identity. They emerge instead as strategic concessions. I'm not going to try to do it by memory here. Adopted through pragmatic adaptation of pre-existing lawmaking institutions. These great reform statutes seem so different from revolutionary constitutions that scholars often deny that the British have a constitution at all. This claim might make sense if constitutionalism were a label designating a one-size-fits-all model of legitimation. But the thesis of this lecture and my work in the next year or two is precisely that there is no single path to constitutionalism. Countries traveling down the insider track do indeed place value on achievements like the Parliament Act of 1911. These landmark statutes serve as precedents of responsible government. As later generations are socialized into the governing elite, they are trained to use them as models when confronting similar confrontations of their own generation. Britain's relative success in the art of pragmatic adaptation has influenced many parts of the Commonwealth, most notably Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, which share a disdain, a very British disdain, for abstract constitutional principles and emphasize the importance of prudent adaptation. Revolutionary outsiders versus responsible insiders. Both ideal types emerge out of a high-pitched struggle with different outcomes. Under the insider scenario, the political establishment makes strategic concessions that undermine outsider momentum. Under the outsider scenario, the establishment fails in its attempts at suppression or co-optation and is overwhelmed by the revolutionary constitutional order. But regime change sometimes occurs without the pressure of a massive popular uprising, and this requires us to add my third and last ideal type. Call it elitist constitutionalism. Under this scenario, the old system of government begins to unravel, but the general population stays passively on the sidelines. Instead, previously excluded political and social elites exploit the emerging power vacuum and play a key role in the creation of a new constitutional order. Sometimes the new elite constitution allows the old elites to continue to play an important role, sometimes not. The key point is that the new regime is an elite construction, not a revolutionary, mass mobilized creation. Spain provides a great example. Franco's death propelled the phalangist system into a succession crisis. Haunted by memories of the Spanish Civil War, moderates led by the king, Juan Carlos, young king, preempted another revolutionary upheaval by reaching an accommodation with Franco's bitterest enemies. Resisting hardline pressure, the young king appointed Adolfo Suarez prime minister, who reached out to bitter opponents, most notably Santiago Carrillo, a leader of the illegal Communist Party. With the support of the Army Chief of Staff and the leader of the Spanish Church, Suarez accomplished the seemingly impossible task of prevailing upon the Franco legislature to pass a law of political reform, setting the stage for free elections that included the communists and other illegal groups. When the electorate gave left and right extremists low levels of support, moderates were in a position to elaborate a democratic constitution, which was overwhelmingly approved at a referendum. These votes were important, but they should not be confused with the kind of mass mobilization that serves as the primary engine of revolutionary constitutionalism. Everybody in Spain who counted agreed, let's not have another Spanish Civil War. That was what we have to avoid. Let's not mobilize and counter-mobilize. It was instead the decisive action of the king, who thwarted a military coup in 1981, that began the generation-long process of constitutional consolidation. I emphasize this point because elite constructions confront very different legitimation problems from those emerging from the first two ideal types. And our next job is to look at each of these three ideal types and see what their distinctive problems and possibilities are. Let's start again with revolutionary constitutionalism. The greatest problem looming down this pathway is totalitarian dictatorship. Lenin and Mao, no less than Nehru and Mandela and De Gasperi and de Gaulle, gained power after revolutionary challenges to the ancien regime. Yet the constitutions generated by the Communist Party have served as mere propaganda devices for Stalinist, Maoist terrors, and have failed to seriously constrain the subsequent authoritarianisms of a Khrushchev or the present Chinese authoritarians. During the Cold War, these communist parodies of constitutions were viewed as almost inevitable consequences of serious revolutionary activity. My current project, one of its aims at least, is to correct this Cold War distortion. In a series of intensive case studies, I mean to show the depth and breadth of the constitutional legacy, the positive constitutional legacy of 20th century revolutions. Consider India, for example. Its pervasive poverty, illiteracy, caste system seem to be a recipe for authoritarianism. There are no preconditions for democracy of the banal sort elaborated in conventional political science. Indeed, there is not even a common language. English is the language of the elite. Yet, its constitutional order has, for all its imperfections, and every constitutional law order has lots of imperfections, sustained a remarkably vital democratic life for almost 3/4 of a century. This is by far the largest democracy in the world, constitutional democracy in the world. We can't just say, oh, it's a special case. Why did it happen? Any sensible answer, there are many particular answers, but any sensible answer must recognize the key role of the Congress Party, which was a revolutionary movement led by Gandhi and Nehru for decades out of power, that sealed its final success with the promulgation of the Constitution of 1950. As I've already suggested, South Africa is the scene of a similar success story, and when you look at it in an impartial way, how could it possibly have happened? These in-depth studies of India and South Africa provide perspective on similar European exercises in revolutionary constitutionalism in places like France, Italy, and Poland, and there are many others in different parts of the world as well. For all their obvious differences from one another, we can identify a common pattern in these success stories. I do not mean to deny that there aren't many failure stories. What I'm interested in is how does it work when it works? This pattern is so distinctive that it deserves a special name. As Dieter suggests, I call it the Constitutionalization of Charisma, because it is analogous to, but fundamentally different from, the process that Weber famously portrayed in describing the bureaucratization of charisma. Bureaucracy is means and rationality. Constitutionalism has to do with substantive aims of the system. Fundamental difference, and Weber didn't want to talk about that. I do. For present purposes, I only have time to highlight two fundamental aspects of the constitutionalization of charisma. One is political, the other is legal. Begin with the political side of the equation. During its first generation, the Constitution reinforces the legitimacy of revolutionary leaders who initially gained power only after making great personal sacrifices, spending years in prison or exile before finally triumphing. One of the features of all of the people, Mandela, de Gasperi, and the like, they all went to jail. And if they didn't go to jail, they went into exile like de Gaulle. But as this first generation dies off, it is replaced by lots of opportunists who see the old revolutionary parties no longer as revolutionary, but as springboards for personal power. To be sure, these parties also attract second-generation activists who want to reinvigorate the old revolutionary ideals. But even they can't claim the charismatic authorities earned by their predecessors. After all, the first generation didn't just talk revolution, they actually engaged in the struggle. But the second generation didn't. And there's a real difference between talking about it and actually winning it. Okay, so over time, there are many, many different variations on this theme, but over time, except in extraordinary circumstances, the balance of authority in this revolutionary pathway moves in the direction of the normalization of revolutionary politics. The opposite is true amongst lawyers and professionals who seek to interpret the meaning of the revolutionary constitution. During the first generation, these professionals are all too aware that the Constitution is a new legal animal which they have not yet domesticated through decades of disciplined professional argument. This predisposes them to avoid sharp confrontations with the charismatic leadership that stands at the helm of the Republic. Nevertheless, there are tentative legal efforts at constitutional interpretation. They're going to do it. They know that if they get too uppity, de Gaulle or Nehru is not going to let them get away with it, and that the people will back Nehru, not the judges. Nonetheless, they're doing it cautiously, and it lays the foundation for succeeding generations of lawyers. For these people who grow up within the new culture, they increasingly view constitutional law as an established part of their professional repertoire. They take examinations in it. There are professors in it. It's just normalized. They're confident now that they know what the Constitution says. Or, there is a Hess and a Meinung, and then there are three other positions, and that kind of thing. As an increasingly confident legal profession and judiciary confronts an increasingly normalized political party system, the two sides engage in intensive struggle to serve as the ultimate guardian of the revolutionary constitutional inheritance. These struggles take different forms in different places, and unfortunately we don't have time to explore these fascinating details at present. I must say I've learned tons in this. I've been spending about the last year or so on this. I've learned a lot of interesting facts. But for present purposes, it's enough to emphasize one key point. These struggles between an increasingly opportunistic political class and an increasingly self-confident judiciary are categorically different from those arising in constitutional polities that are traveling down the other two ideal types. That's the important point for this lecture. So next, let's turn to the insider paradigm, which was my second, if you recall, of responsible government. Within this framework, it makes absolutely no sense for constitutional courts to function as the guardian of revolutionary principles established by the Constitution, since the very idea that the people can speak during moments of constitutional upheaval in a constitutional manner is populist garbage. That's what insiders think. They're screaming and yelling. These people don't know what they're talking about. Let's be sensible about this. Within the framework of insider constitutionalism, courts can at best play a collaborative role in clarifying the tradition of elite rule, proposing insightful ways of modifying historical precedents in the light of current challenges. This is a very good role, but it's different. That's my only point. This is precisely the collaborative path which has been pursued by courts and parliaments in Britain and other Commonwealth countries over the past half century. A very fine book I recommended to you by Stephen Gardbaum is called The Commonwealth Model, which tries to elaborate just this pattern. Insider regimes also confront different challenges to their constitutional authority. In contrast to their revolutionary counterparts, the threat is not party dictatorship. Instead, it is the gradual erosion of public confidence in the elite's capacity for statesmanship, with grassroots movements gaining increasing success in portraying the establishment, now with a capital E, as blundering snobs, unworthy of respect. The recent rise of referenda in Britain and the Commonwealth may well be a danger signal in this regard. Referenda are incompatible with sensible statesmanship. People get screamy yelly too quickly. But for now, it's more important to move onward to the third ideal type. What are the distinctive problems confronting an elitist constitution? For starters, these regimes lack the legitimation resources provided by either of the preceding paradigms. On the one hand, they can't point to the broad popular legitimacy earned by a successful revolutionary constitution. On the other hand, they lack the long history of successful statesmanship through which an established elite gains broad public respect. Not the same thing as mobilized support, but just as important. How then is the elitist constitution to credibly establish its authority to the broader population? With difficulty. Call this the authenticity problem. And we see it on display in Spain today. Despite its relatively good performance over the last 40 years, the post-Franco constitution has failed to convince many Basques and Catalans of its legitimacy, generating the current conflict between Madrid and Barcelona over the terms of a referendum for Catalan independence. There is, of course, a broad analogy between this standoff and the recent confrontation between Westminster and Scotland, which also revolved around a vote of national independence. But the legal form of the referendum has very different meanings within different constitutional ideal types. The British establishment characteristically muddled its way through to a compromise, which permitted the referendum to proceed to a no vote, after making strategic concessions which they're now taking back. But that's politics for you. In contrast, the Madrid government, with the support of the Constitutional Court, insists that the very effort to hold a referendum is unconstitutional. Period. It remains to be seen whether this elite insistence on the rule of law will succeed, or whether it will provoke the Catalans to defy the center. They're already organizing an informal referendum. Illegal, that means. That's what an informal referendum is, an illegal referendum. And if there's a yes vote, Will they try to use that as a basis for a revolutionary break? Many things like that have happened in the history of revolutionary constitutionalism. The point of this talk or my book is not to evaluate what's good and bad. I've done that in other work. What I'm trying to do is understand the difference in different constitutional cultures, which is independent and interesting in its own right. The current confrontation on the peninsula only serves as an introduction to the authenticity problems confronting other elite constructions. At least the Spanish Constitution was written by indigenous Spanish elites who put it up to a popular vote. In contrast, the constitutions of post-war Germany and Japan were written under military occupation by the Allies. Moreover, these elite constructions were adopted without any effort to obtain the consent of ordinary voters at a referendum. In such cases, why should the general public respect their legitimacy after the military occupiers leave? Sometimes this question has absolutely no answer. Consider, for example, the collapse of the recent constitutions of occupied Iraq and Afghanistan as the Americans leave. Nobody believes that this is Constitution for Iraq. It was a constitution imposed on Iraq. Goodbye. You know, the imposers have left. Goodbye. Sometimes they only arise with great force after long periods of quiescence. Consider today's Japan, where the Abe government is challenging the peace article of the Constitution imposed by General MacArthur. No less important, Abe's challenge is only the opening gun in a larger campaign. I've been writing quite a bit about this in various newspapers because we have not, people aren't taking account of this. For a more sweeping repudiation of the post-war Japanese constitution as an inauthentic expression of true Japanese values. Which leads to an obvious question. How has Germany avoided a similar reckoning with the Basic Law? To be sure, the role of the Allied occupation in the creation of the Basic Law wasn't quite as overwhelming as in Japan, but it was still very overwhelming. Beginning with the conditions laid down by Britain, France, and the United States in the London Protocol. Two of the protocol's key demands were first, that the Parlamentarisches Rat, or Parliamentary Council, draft a document called a constitution, or Verfassung. And second, that the Parlamentarisches Rat submit the Verfassung to the German people for their approval at a referendum. The precise point of these requirements, unambiguous, clear, and decisive by the Allies, was to anticipate the problem of authenticity. So that when they left, it wouldn't just be, this is the Americans' Constitution, go to hell. The London Protocol was addressed to the leaders of the newly created governments in each of the occupied zones. They were created and by the Allies, of course. In order to run, you had to get approval by the occupation authorities and the like. But the rising West German political elite rejected the demands of the protocol, despite the overwhelming military presence of the Allies. They refused to call their document a constitution, but called it the Grundgesetz, or Basic Law, to emphasize its provisional character. What is more, they added a final article proclaiming that a truly authentic constitution, Verfassung, could be promulgated only when the citizens of the East joined the Westerners at a new constituent assembly. That's the Schluss article of the Grundgesetz. They also defied the Allies, and defied is the only word to describe it, by refusing to submit the Grundgesetz to a referendum, in part because it might have lost in Bavaria, in part because Hitler had degraded such focus appeals during the Nazi period. In a forthcoming book, Donald Commerce, who was an old fellow at the American Academy, describes the consequences of these acts of defiance. Here is what he says, I'm quoting here. Opinion polls showed that most West Germans had little interest in the proceedings of the Parliamentary Council. Only 1 in 5 Germans in the American zone expressed a quote-unquote serious interest in the Council's debates. A majority of the respondents were not even aware of the Parliamentary Council's existence. In May of 1949, a survey found that 2/3 of them were not sure what the Basic Law was. After all, I'm just quoting him, West German voters were denied this chance to approve the Constitution, depriving them also of the knowledge they might have gained about its content had a popular campaign for ratification taken place. End of quotation. Within this context, the Basic Law's famous eternity clauses have a very curious ring. What does it mean for an emphatically provisional document to proclaim the eternal value of human dignity? What does it mean for it to proclaim democracy, quote unquote, as an eternal value when its proponents refuse to submit the Basic Law to a vote? This is a performative contradiction, as Jürgen Habermas might put it. The authenticity of problem arose once again in 1989, with East German demonstrators chanting, "Wir sind das Volk." The vice president of the West German Constitutional Court, Ernst Gottfried Mannholz, emphasized the immediate relevance of the final article's assertion that only a constituent assembly of the entire German people had the authority to draft a new constitution. Mannholz presented the case most eloquently, but there were many others who joined in this debate on his side. Helmut Kohl, however, was not among them. The last thing he wanted was a lot of East German communists and West German leftists entering a constituent assembly to challenge the legitimacy of his government. Instead of taking the call for a new constitution before the German people, the new constitution might be more or less similar to the Grundgesetz. No, that's a different question. But actually arguing about that. Kohl engineered reunification by means of one of the most curious international agreements in the history of international law. The Standard Treaty is negotiated by 2 sovereigns for a purpose. The purpose is to regulate their future relationships with one another. That's what a treaty is. In contrast, the Wiedervereinigungsvertrag, or Reunification Treaty, extinguished the existence of the DDR at the very moment it signed the agreement. What kind of treaty is this? Moreover, I'll just add, there are provisions in the Reunification Treaty which were unconstitutional under the Basic Law. For example, that there was free abortion for a year. This is unconstitutional under the law of West Germany, of the Republic. And yet it was yet a quarter century later, Germany has managed to forget that its political elite, both in 1949 and in 1989, refused to place the Constitution before the people for their popular ownership. My question again is, how did such an act of collective amnesia take place? This is a real puzzle. During the 1950s, and I don't have an answer, I'm just going to throw out a few things, but this is more for you. You have more insight into this question than I. During the 1950s and 60s, it was the Wirtschaftswunder. not the Grundgesetz, that played the central role in legitimating the rise of the Federal Republic out of the ashes of the Nazi regime. This is legitimation through outcome. I think it's almost a mistake to call it legitimation, but it's outcome that did it. If I had to choose a single symbol of the new Germany during this early period, it would be the Deutschmark, not the Grundgesetz. But over time, the German Constitutional Court successfully made the Basic Law into a central element of political identity. To the point where the replacement of the Deutschmark by the euro could occur in the 1990s without the national trauma that would have accompanied a similar displacement if the Deutschmark had been eliminated in 1965. What was the symbol of Germany in 1965? The Deutschmark. But once again, the court's role was very different from that played by judiciaries emerging out of the previous two scenarios. It did not root the Basic Law in the revolutionary achievements of the constitutional past, since there weren't any. Nor did it engage in a modest collaborative enterprise with the established political branches as in Great Britain. Instead, the court has projected itself into the public space as the preeminent guardian of the new Germany's foundational commitments to fundamental rights and Enlightenment values. Of course, the way the court has gained public acceptance for its claims to constitutional supremacy is a complicated matter, and one which I will address, hopefully, in this book. But for now, let's stand back and return to the larger implications of my claim that there are three, not one, distinct paths to constitutionalism. To drive this point home, I invite you to consider how my Trinitarian view adds up to a special trilemma for the European Union at this moment of vulnerability. There's an ongoing disagreement about the nature of the Union. Some believe that it is broadly comparable to other great federations, most notably the United States. Others view the Union as unique, fundamentally different from America or, let's say, India. Not that they think about India much. My discussion pushes me into the uniqueness camp, but for a new reason. As I've suggested, the leading nations of Europe come to the Union along different paths. The constitutions of Germany and Spain are elite constructions. France and Italy and Poland are revolutionary achievements. Great Britain emerges from an insider tradition. Little wonder these countries have trouble finding a common pathway to a more perfect union, because they don't even agree about the way to go forward. The French and Italians are open to transformative appeals to the people of Europe. It's no accident that Giscard d'Estaing is at the head of the Brussels Convention. He is trying to renovate and adapt the French revolutionary tradition to the European Union and legitimate the democracy deficit. The British prefer muddling through, and the Germans are utterly perplexed by the very idea that political elites or mobilized movements may legitimately transform foundational constitutional commitments. There's the Constitution. Its function is to structure democracy. How did we get the Constitution? That's not my department. No similar disagreements exist in the United States. From the founding, through the Civil War, through the New Deal and Civil Rights revolutions, Americans have repeatedly transformed their Constitution through revolutionary challenges under the leadership of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, and the team of Martin Luther King and Lyndon Johnson. This is, as Dieter suggests, the basic thesis of a series of books of mine called We the People. Behold, then, a paradox. While present-day Americans bitterly disagree on the legitimacy of the welfare state in a way that's not similar to Europe, The entire political spectrum, from Tea Party Republicans through left-wing Democrats like myself, recognize how we're going to resolve this disagreement. And we will resolve it. Quite simply, if a Tea Party Republican wins the White House in 2016, the new president will unite with his right-wing allies in Congress to revolutionize the Constitution by transforming the personnel of the Supreme Court as liberal justices retire. This new right-wing judicial majority will, by a series of 7-2 votes, sweep away many of the hard-won achievements of the New Deal civil rights regime in America. I hasten to add that I will be proud to number myself among the bitter end opponents of this constitutional revolution if it happens. This is why the election of 2016 is not unimportant. Nevertheless, I won't be able to deny that President Tea Party, whoever he or she may turn out to be, his or her effort to pack the Supreme Court with right-wingers will look very similar to the court-packing maneuver through which Franklin Roosevelt managed to constitutionalize the New Deal in the 1930s. Americans might well repudiate the New Deal welfare state, but they will do so through the methods established by the New Deal. President, Congress, Supreme Court, struggling over a series of elections, the revolutionaries winning time after time and codifying their victory in a new jurisprudence by a new Supreme Court. Europeans are in a very different predicament. They are not at present raising fundamental challenges to their social democratic legacy in the way that the Tea Party is to our version of social democracy, which is the New Deal. But because they come out of disparate constitutional cultures, they are having a tough time dealing with the regional politics of redistribution, that is a characteristic feature of all federations. All federations. In the United States, for example, the rich North and the poor South have been engaged in battles over how much of the federal pie they're going to steal from one another for centuries. These disputes, though, don't risk unraveling the revolutionary constitutional heritage built up over the centuries, which permits me, a progressive Democrat, to understand how I should stop this revolution in its tracks. In contrast, the disintegration of the European Union is a very real prospect on the continent, as the North-South confrontation provokes a host of grassroots movements against the austerity programs imposed by Brussels and Frankfurt. The victory by Syriza may well set the stage for another left-wing takeover by Podemos in Spain later this year. If the Union's political and banking institutions fail to respond to these outsider revolutionary challenges in a constructive fashion, the resulting impasse will frame even more dangerous right-wing revolutionary challenges from UKIP and the National Front in the next round of British and French elections. These impending struggles would have been framed very differently if European history had taken a different turn a decade ago. That was the moment when the Brussels Convention launched an appeal to the peoples of Europe to constitutionalize their political identity through the popular ratification of a constitutional treaty. If this campaign had succeeded, Europe would have been in a much better position to deal with the grassroots revolutionary challenges that threaten union-wide legitimacy today. But it failed. That's life. This key point is ignored by scholars who emphasize how much the Lisbon Treaty endorsed the substance of the initiatives proposed by the Brussels Convention. This is absolutely true. But Lisbon and more recent agreements were elite constructions that avoided as much as possible self-conscious consideration by the peoples of Europe at referenda. This decade of evasion is allowing rising protest movements to present the Union and the Bank as alien forces dominated by harsh technocrats with union politicians serving as pseudo-democratic ornaments for Angela Merkel. Is there a way out of this impasse? I do not know. There is some consolation, however, in reflecting on a basic limitation of my analysis. As Weber emphasized, no real-world polity perfectly expresses any ideal type. That's the whole idea of an ideal type. One type may predominate, in this case in Europe, elite constitutionalism. But particular historical experiences generate counter-themes from competing paradigms. This lecture is an invitation to Europeans to think more deeply about the distinctive mix of constitutional cultures currently prevailing on the continent, and to develop the themes that have the greatest promise to sustain the legitimacy of the Union at this very dangerous moment in its history. Only one thing is clear. It is better to be self-conscious about the cultural trilemma underlying the current Euro crisis, which is much more profound than who's going to pay how much to whom, than to blunder forward blindly and pretend that elitist top-down impositions will suffice. Thank you very much. Both of us.
Thank you very much, Bruce.
Yeah. Are you going to ask a first question?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So
This
come
is
over.
certainly a provoking lecture, and a lecture that gives rise to a number of questions. I could ask a number. I will just start by asking one.
Yeah, no one else will ask a question, then you can ask a second or third one.
Time one, we have the charismatics. Time two, we have the opportunists. Time three, you didn't mention time three, but one could call it time three, the courts take over. This is surprising. Haven't we been taught for many years that courts are the least dangerous branch, which means, of course, the least powerful branch? What if governments decide just not to obey? What can courts do? The government says, so what? Or like which president of the United States, was it Jackson?
Yes.
Justice Marshall has taken his decision that
You enforce it, yes.
Yeah. So this is surprising, I think, and it needs an explanation why it is possible that this least dangerous branch can take over and assume this role.
The answer, you see, I mean, one of the ambitions of this and much else of my work is to situate the court, as your question is suggesting, within the larger constitutional regime of the political actors and the court. So you're asking, what are the historical dynamics that lead the politicians of a particular moment to say, aha, yes, you're right. It's in our interest to let you become the guardian of the Constitution. And then the court exercises its momentum, exercises its moment of political support and develops a stronger and stronger legal autonomy. It is never, my claim is never, I'm only explaining one dimension of the problem of political stability, the legitimation dimension. What I mean by legitimation is that people inside the system say, the Conseil d'État in France today, but not in the first generation when de Gaulle was president, is the primary spokesman of the Constitution. How did this happen? We can tell the political story. It's a fascinating political story. Will, when Marine Le Pen becomes president of the Republic, she is faced with a problem. There is this entire, God help us. There is this entire jurisprudence. Many people say, this Constitutional Council is, an important institution, and it's going to get into a crisis with her. How will it be resolved? I am not trying to present a general theory of everything. There are many, this is the style right now, there are many American political scientists who tell you, here is the answer to political stability, of one kind or another. This is not, I'm just trying to say, you're right, Dieter, but we have to account for the fact that Marine Le Pen will know that she has a serious problem, and that she might actually destroy her political a future if the if the Conseil is too aggressively against her. And how to account for that legitimation by the court. That's enough of a problem for me. Thank you.
I already have 3 names on my list.
Good.
And I hope you allow me to ask you to ask brief questions and to give brief answers if possible.
Well, just 2 observations on the 2 non-constitutional moments in German history which you have identified. The first one, 1949. Why wasn't there a referendum? Why didn't the fathers and mothers of the Grundgesetz not call it a Verfassung? Because people were afraid that to have a referendum would really be the death knell for Germany as a unit, as a German state. No? That was the decisive element, I think, which moved people not to organize a referendum, because people in East Germany would not have been able to vote it. And the second one, 1990, there was a window of opportunity, which was a very short one. And if we had started negotiating process on a new constitution, it would have lasted months and years maybe, and then the moment of opportunity would have disappeared. That was a real fear among politicians, and I think they were right, absolutely right.
Well, let me just emphasize.
Sorry, of course.
I mean, this is. I mean, just keep it. I think you're absolutely right that this anxiety about the East in '49 and a different anxiety about the East in '89 is a factor. But the military strategic position of Germany, both in 1949 and 1989, was a factor. But consider the real political situation in 1949. Here are the Americans saying, do this. And these Germans are saying, no? That's very surprising. And that's, and similarly, we can discuss 1989. It might have well been possible to have integrated East Germany in a provisional way and indeed there were processes in 1990, 91, 92, which generated various and sundry proposals, didn't get anywhere. Okay. It's very important. I mean, I agree with you entirely, yeah.
Thank you. Could you explain why you think that if Europe would have decided on the constitutional treaty, why it would be right now in a better situation? Because with regard to the content, the constitutional treaty is more or less the same as the Treaty of Lisbon. So there must be something. Could you elaborate on this? What is your argument? Thank you.
The argument is political identity. Let's imagine. You see, one of the. Let's imagine this. The Germans were did not want to have a referendum. But let's imagine that instead of it starting in France, it had started in Germany. And we had had a constitutional referendum with the Germans voting yes, which was quite likely. I've looked at the numbers. And this would have shaped the referenda struggle in France, et cetera, and so forth. What we would have seen is the peoples of Europe, soberly or not so soberly, considering whether we did indeed want a more perfect European Union, and coming out with yes. Would the president of the commission have been some minor league character? Or would he have been someone like Tony Blair? That is to say, within this structure of authority, being the president of the commission is quite a different thing, et cetera and so forth. So the notion of deep democratic legitimation, the banalities about the democracy deficit. There's always a democracy deficit. Every country has a democracy deficit. But this would have been understood as a turning point. Well, this is my thesis. But once again, I'm not trying to say it's a magic cure-all. We would still have a big crisis now. But we would have a legitimating resource and a different understanding of the central institutions and the presidency of the council and the commission than we do now.
One of the striking features of your account is that it focuses very strongly on a very important moment in the life of a constitution, which is how it gets established. What is the condition, what are the constellations under which it first establishes legitimacy? And of course we understand why that is an important moment, because it's the moment where arguably the situation is most volatile. This is a most precarious moment. So of course that matters, and of course that will have influences over the first generation and maybe the second generation of the Constitution. But I wonder if your question is a more general one, how do constitutions legitimate? I wonder whether once we come to generation 3 or we move further on, it is not obvious, and it's a highly contingent question, what the role of the stories relating to founding are. So it may well be simply that it doesn't matter very much.
Well, this has to do, you see, I hate to, point to the various European sources of my reflections. It has to do with what you think of collective memory and the French school of theory and historiography about the status of collective memory. When we look at, to take another couple of examples, Modi today, he is very self-consciously having a revolution to redefine, and you see when I'm, there's suddenly a lot of literature redefining Nehru, redefining Ambedkar, who was the draftsman. He is trying to, he thinks it's important from the internal point of view to legitimate his authority, to explore and explain his relationship to the founding moment. But I certainly agree with you. To put it in political science terms, I'm just talking about path dependence. And it's perfectly possible at some other crisis turning point for there to be a change. And that's one of the points of these ideal types is not to say that, you're committed to one track and you have to go down, 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 down. And that it's just that the aim here is to ask us, what can we learn by comparing, let's say, India and Nehru to de Gaulle and France? Well, to be frank, nobody asked that question. Maybe they won't after this lecture either, but I'm giving it a try.
Thank you. Why should a referendum be the only way to legitimize a constitution? If you look at the German situation, the Grundgesetz was written by Germans, by the way, not by the Allies.
Oh, yes, of
In a
course.
German tradition, in a German constitutional tradition, taking, for example, quotes from 1848 and so on. So in a certain German tradition, and of course under Allied occupation. But then you had hundreds of elections in towns, regions, Länder, in the federal level, and of course this also causes a kind of legitimacy because it is an approval to the system and to the Grundgesetz. And of course, I appreciate that view that referendum is a certain direct legitimization, but on the other hand, you have through state practice and through the life and even the Wirtschaftswunder under this system, under this Grundgesetz, is also a way of legitimization.
Well, first, I agree with you. That is to say, the legal form of referendum is not central to my argument. Notice, the Spanish elite construction, after the Spanish Constitution is mostly written by German legal scholars, just Spanish-German legal scholars, who write it behind closed doors. Then they send it to a referendum and it's approved 98% to 2%. That's nothing. That's important, but not very important. The Indian Constitution is not approved at referendum. It is rather the movement party, the decades of mobilization, the sacrifice for the idea of India, the fact that your uncle went to jail one day in a demonstration in support of Mahatma Gandhi, that commits you to the Constitution. You are pointing out that Germany's legitimation isn't like that, but isn't the referendum. It is neither based on a successful revolution, nor is it based upon, you see, that's a big difference between Japan and Germany. The emperor remains in power as a symbol. The admiral, whoever he is, who does Hitler appoint? Yeah, Dönitz. No. We have Stunde Null. Germany, first and foremost, is not a democracy. It is a liberal, foundational republic based upon human dignity. If the German people, by a vote of 80 to 20, say that the Muslims should be treated as second-class citizens, it is the obligation of the German Constitutional Court to strike this legislation down. It's better for the Constitutional Court to go down fighting against a populist democracy of an irrational kind than to give in. In the United States, that isn't true. When the Supreme Court resists, the mobilized Tea Party keeps on resisting, but at a certain point, even though it's going to do really bad things, it gives in because of its history. That's a fundamental difference so I basically think that you and I are agreeing that there are different paths to legitimation in the modern world, and it's a mistake to have one label, liberal democratic constitutionalism, blinding ourselves to the distinctive differences within this large family.
I would like to offer perhaps a bit of a polemic answer to this question, why there were no referendum, because maybe nobody was interested in having one. And the question is, why was nobody interested in having one? Maybe one part of the elite was really raised in a quite authoritarian way, an authoritarian tradition. And the other part who was not and was maybe more democratic was possibly afraid of the totalitarian streak, let's say, in in the population, and the people themselves were relatively content in being ruled, in being governed. And so in the end, nobody was there to really formulate a strong demand in this respect.
Well, you know, I mean, this, of course, is a historical question. And I think that when we look at the documents, because there are many of them, reasonable people can disagree. I think that the first consideration of anxiety about the legitimation of the East Zone is a real one. Also, one which I've seen a lot in the record is we might lose in Bavaria. We just might not win in Bavaria. Nevertheless, there is a tremendous amount of anxiety expressed. Will the Allies respond by delegitimating the whole thing? You see, because it was within the Allies' power to simply say, oh, well, we're not doing what you asked. What we're asking is not unreasonable from a democratic point of view. But it's a question which is one of historical interpretation. But as Matthias was saying, that we then have a paradigm, and how important is that paradigm over time depends on the role of historical memory in constitutionalism. Deep question, which really this book was only going to raise rather than resolve.
A more basic question. A more basic question, if I may. Frankly, I didn't really grasp the difference between your insiders and your elitists. Could you maybe outline that a little bit more by pointing out maybe their various different power bases, means of pressure, a perspective that seems to be somewhat neglected in your way of thinking?
The difference is that the insider constitution is done through unilateral concessions. It isn't as if in the history of the Reform Act, they start talking to the radicals and saying, let's make a deal. They just say, let's do this reform now. In Spain, there is a self-conscious deal between the inside elites and the outside elites. This is analytically independent of another fundamental point that you're raising, which is indeed fundamental: power relations. The terms of the concession in the second model, the terms of the bargain, is going to be a function of, let's say, how much Suarez thinks that the head of the Communist Party, if he doesn't like it, is going to actually mobilize his masses and make a lot of trouble. If he thinks that it's not going to happen, then Carrillo, who's the communist head, is weak. If he thinks it might well happen, then he's going to make a better deal. But the difference is it's really King William III who threatens to pack the House of Lords. And that's what gets the Reform Act through in behalf of appeal, and I don't want to get into the history. While that's not, it's to paraphrase Gilbert and Sullivan, bow down, ye lower middle classes. While in the Spanish context, it isn't Juan Carlos who is saying, we're going to concede this to you. It's very much a self-conscious deal. That's the difference. Power relations obtain in all three models. Only a beginning.
There are two more questions, and I think that after these two, the time has come to draw a line and to continue the conversation outside this room. You are next.
Okay, in the case of Spain, as an example, we have in Spain a different kind of constitution in very small time. Franco time, then before Franco, it was monarchy, a different constitution than Franco. After Franco, monarchy again, and now with a new constitution, we have problems again, and we have Podemos, Basco, and so on. How to legitimate a constitution in such a instability socio-political situation? Because Europe as a nation or an union is not very different as the situation in Spain.
This is a fascinating question. How long a time should you expect a constitution to last? 2 or 3 generations, that's doing very well without a fundamental change. The American Constitution, don't be fooled by the fact that it was some piece of paper was written in 1787 between slave owners and merchants who thought that democracy was terrible and the republic was good. That regime ended in the Civil War 75 years later. The liberal Constitution of the United States ends 75 years later in 1930s. Spain has done rather well. It has sustained a political order that's functioned better than Italy's in the last 40 years. And Italy's is not so bad. It really isn't. It's a myth to suppose that constitutions last forever. The Constitution of Germany, after the Bonn Republic transforms into the Berlin Republic, is significantly different. 50, 75 years, a long time. It isn't so, Spain is a success story, in my view. Of course, when we have, let's say, Afghanistan or Iraq or something, you're going to have 42 constitutions within 3 weeks. That's failing.
Thank you. Basically, your underlying assumption for the problem of the EU right now is that we have different pathways of different nations and different stories that they are telling themselves about the constitutions.
Constitutional cultures.
Constitutional cultures. So, assuming you are saying that it is possible to change your constitutional culture, so basically it's a follow-up, how much of a mess do we need to actually get a new constitution or a uniting constitution in Europe if we really wanted it?
One central idea of mine is something that I call unconventional adaptation. We have too simple a notion of constitutional change. On the one hand, we have an idea of constitutional change, of perfectly legitimate lawmaking, which satisfies the existing constitution perfectly. Then, on the other side, we have a total break of institutions, as in Lenin in 1918 eliminating the Constituent Assembly that was brought in by Kerensky, and he eliminates any link to the Tsar. Right? Many constitutional transformations are in the middle. Certain institutions of the old regime are creatively adapted, and new institutions are added. That's the positive way, for example, of talking about what the European Central Bank is doing right now, which is deeply problematic under the governing laws. I don't want to get into the particular argument. Deeply problematic. It's adapting the structure in ways that may or may not either get out of the problem through economic prosperity or legitimate the entire complex order. Giscard tried for a big bang. It failed. We're not going to get back there for another 15 years. What we need is constitutional imagination and creativity rather than thinking merely that the law is the law and all you people in Southern Europe better get with the program, period, end of message. Because that's a crisis. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the questions because I'm, as is only painfully apparent, still working at this.
And more questions will be.
Oh yeah, right, sure.
So I think you are in